The bright side of addiction is recovery. And recovery begins with hope. If you're new to our podcast, we welcome you. And if you have been here before, we welcome you back. And if you're in recovery or know or love someone who is, or you simply want to know more about the recovery process, or maybe you're a bit concerned about someone you know or love who is harmfully using alcohol or any other drug, this is the podcast for you. We carry the message of hope and the promise of recovery. And a reminder, you can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. Recent episodes have featured interviews with Thomas Hollywood Henderson, NFL player, also an NFL player, Ryan Leaf, authors J.A. Jantz, Anne Lamott, and Brene Brown, plus astronaut Buzz Aldrin, and a lot more. All these interviews and more, plus conversations with everyday people in long-term recovery, sharing their experience, their strength, and their hope. Now, in this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, we're going to feature two guests, a current member of Congress, the Honorable Madeleine Dean, Democrat from the state of Pennsylvania, and her son Harry, who hit bottom in the middle of a political campaign when he found his moment of clarity. Here is a quick clip from my conversation with Congresswoman Dean. You had a conversation with President Biden, one-on-one, about alcoholism, addiction, and recovery. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, we swapped books. I gave him our book, and he mailed me Hunter's book, which I read, of course.
Yes.
And then when I saw him next, I talked to him about it. I said, thank you so much for sharing Hunter's book. I could identify with so much of the pain and the joy of recovery. He thanked me for my book, and he said, I promise to work with you. I said, Mr. President, if you and I can work on one thing together, it's going to be about this issue. And he said, I promise to work with you. It means so much to my family. So it was parent to parent. It felt so right.
And a quick clip from her son, Harry.
When I first got into recovery, it was just not use. I just need to not use today. And while that for me is still a really important part of it, recovery for me really means to be able to continue to grow, to evolve and to change and to continuously just try to be a better person. My recovery over the years, I've been in recovery consistently since October 30th, 2012. You know, when I think about recovery today, I think about really the opportunity to heal. And that's an ever-moving target for me. It continues to, there's layers and layers of this recovery onion that I continue to peel back.
You'll hear the story from both sides coming up shortly. But plus, iconic actor Dick Van Dyke will share some words of inspiration from his decades-long adventure in personal recovery. Our website is recoverycoasttocoast.org. And if you'd like to help us out financially or know of a foundation that might be interested in underwriting part of our program, we would be so grateful. Our email address, recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Recovery Coast to Coast, supported by Sundown Am Ranch, and that's one of America's oldest, least expensive, and most successful treatment programs. Now, if you have heart disease, you don't shop for treatment. If you have cancer, well, you want the very best medical care. You don't shop around and look for the cheapest place to go. You realize that these are life-threatening diseases that demand the best possible care. The same with addiction. It, too, is a life-threatening disease, and finding the best care, absolutely essential. Now, there are thousands of treatment centers around the country. Many of them are excellent and patient-centered. Sadly, some of them are not and are more interested in the financial bottom line. At Sundown Am Ranch, their bottom line is the patient's long-term recovery. Their motto is, the patient is the reason that we're here, and they have been there for over 55 years. One of the oldest treatment programs in the country. Abstinence-based and 12-step centered, they own their own land just outside of Yakima, Washington, not too far from Seattle. And they don't just treat and release. They follow the patient back into the community, providing a set of tools to maintain personal recovery. Now, if you are considering a treatment program for yourself or maybe for a family member or a friend, definitely check out Sundown M Ranch, proud members of NAATP, the National Association of Addiction Treatment Providers. Check out their website for more information. Take a look-see at their facility, which, again, is not far from Seattle. You can find photos at sundown.org/gallery. Well, I invite you to join me for a cup of coffee as I share two wonderful and inspiring conversations with a mom and her son. The mom in question is the Honorable Madeleine Dean, Democratic Congresswoman from Pennsylvania, and her son, Harry, whose life spiraled out of control into deep addiction. And finally, he found his way into long-term recovery. The conversation was recorded at the recent National Leadership Conference of NAATP, the National Association of Addiction Treatment Providers, held in Denver, Colorado. Let's begin with Mom's story. Here is Congresswoman Madeleine Dean. Welcome back once again to Recovery Coast to Coast, America's voice for recovery. We are taking the program on the road to Denver, Colorado, the 45th National Leadership Conference from NAATP, the National Association of Addiction Treatment Providers. And the keynote speaker at this morning's session, Congresswoman Madeleine Dean, representing Pennsylvania's 4th Congressional District. She has as a priority alcoholism and drug addiction. And part of that reason is because of her son, Harry. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Welcome to the podcast, Congresswoman. I appreciate your time, and it's very valuable.
Thank you, Neil, and why don't you call me Mad? That's what I go by.
Call you Mad?
Mad.
People have been calling me Mad all my life.
It suits me.
Okay, Mad, now that we're on first name terms here. Tell us about living a life of addiction with your son and not knowing what to do.
Oh, it was a terrible time. Harry is now 33 and in long-term recovery. But years ago, 12 years ago, he was a young man in junior high and high school, and all of his gifts were just ebbing away. His smarts, his personality, his fun, his health, just ebbing away. Chronically sick, chronically fatigued. I knew intuitively or instinctively, maybe a mom's instinct, what was going on. And
did you try to help? What
yes,
did you do?
Well, we battled for a long time. I was angry and scared and worried, and we battled, and he denied that it was addiction. He denied he was using. I would get to a point where I'd drug test him, but the battle would brew in our house, so he almost sort of knew it was coming. My husband didn't like drug testing, wanted to trust Harry, so I didn't really discover it that way. But we discovered it, and literally on October 30th, 2012, we confronted him and we said, Harry, we see money missing from our account. We know what it's about. It's drugs. Are you ready to get help? And he said yes. And this was years of battling and saying we know what it is. We were sure of it, but we had the proof. We had the evidence.
Was it a case of being sick and tired, of being sick and tired?
I think so. I think you're right, because as I said in the talk today, if you know Harry could spin a fanciful tale for why something was missing, why he was late, why he couldn't get anything done. And he just had these wonderful, fanciful tales of being pulled over and doing this. When we finally confronted him, I think he had hit that moment. He was sick and tired of being sick and tired.
You had an expression this morning I had not heard before, unfairly fair.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
He taught me that. You know, we're a white family, and when Harry was young, he looked even younger. He looked like a child. He was a baby face driving a car in suburban Philadelphia, going to places he shouldn't be going to buy drugs and do other things. And I only learned it in his recovery, that he said, I was pulled over many times. They had me dead to rights. But they'd say, oh, kid, what do you look at my license? And they'd say, oh, kid, get out of here. You don't belong here. If his skin color had not been white, if he had not been the baby face with a suburban address, do you think he would not have had a criminal record? We know too many people of color struggling with addiction who have criminal records, or poor people. You don't have to be of color.
Yeah.
So.
He went to an outstanding treatment program in Karen, used to be called Chit Chat.
That's right.
Way back when.
when.
How did that come to be? How did you decide on treatment for Harry there?
I was preparing for weeks. I knew we were going to hit a moment where I'd be able to confront him.
Nice.
And I knew of Karen because I had had family members go through it many, many years before. And as I said, my uncle, a Roman Catholic priest, knew Mr. and Mrs. Karen back in the day and was friends with them when it was chit chat. And so I just knew of its reputation. I called ahead. I did my homework. And I thought to myself, and I investigated other places for treatment, other well-regarded places. But when we confronted him and he said yes, I said, "You're going to Karen." We got right on the phone. We had a conference call in our bedroom. I'll never forget sitting on the floor and on the bed and planning for him to go that day to Karen because I knew of its excellence.
Alcoholism is a family disease, and recovery involves the family. Did you go through the family program?
We did, and I'm so glad we did. You can imagine when we drove him there that day, I was both terrified and delighted. Terrified that he might elope in the night, not accept treatment, not accept help, terrified for his life, and so delighted that we were finally here after years of battling and not knowing and being in the dark. And so when they said there's a family program, we said, terrific, and we have 2 sons. They came also to the family program. So it was powerful for us to learn, for my husband, for my boys to learn about this disease and how it impacts the brain and how it impacts behavior and how it impacts the whole family.
The community and the country.
Exactly right. My girlfriend had an expression. She was so smart. And she said, family is like a mobile. When one spins out of control, the whole family goes with him.
Yeah.
And so that's where we were. We were a mobile spinning out of control. And Karen helped us understand where we were.
What did you learn in family recovery?
I learned that, number one, it was okay to say what I was afraid of. I don't know if this is common, but I'd failed to speak it. And so literally they had us write on a whiteboard, what are some of your fears? Never finishing school, small things like that. And then I paused and I feared that addiction would take his life. But we did learn that it was a disease of the brain. Treatment takes time, particularly opioid addiction.
Yeah.
Treatment takes time, and Harry fought that originally, thinking, I can't believe I signed up for 28 days, let alone anything more. But fortunately, he went on for more treatment.
Talk about the first year and the changes and the challenges in the home with Harry now in early recovery.
Well, thanks for asking. It was a challenging time. He went for 1 month, and then he went on for 3 months to another location called Little Creek, which was just young men, and that was a very helpful place for him. And when he came back from there and came back into our home, I had so many fears. Would all of that treatment be for naught? Would he fall back into his old habits, his patterns, his friends? You hear about people, places, and things.
Yeah.
I worried about our own house because we have alcohol. And I literally asked Harry, should we remove all alcohol? And he said, no, that's not going to be a problem for me. I worried about him going back to the work he had been doing before because I thought maybe that's the root of his addiction. See how foolish I was. And so I felt like we tiptoed around each other in early recovery. I tried to go with him. Neil, this is how naive I was. I said, I'll go with you to a meeting. Would you like me to go with you? Are you kidding? No, you're not going. And so we tiptoed around, and I tried not to be too observant, but I was keenly noticing, could he get up on time? And you know what happens when someone goes into recovery. They come back.
Yeah.
We noticed his voice came back.
They come back better than ever.
Better than ever. And the joy in his voice, the sound of his voice, my husband and I both noticed. His ability to act and behave and do what he needed to do and go to his meetings. First year was tricky, but very joyful when I look back.
You and your son Harry wrote a book called Under Our Roof.
We did.
A son's battle for recovery, a mother's battle for her son. What precipitated writing the book, and what has the response been from that?
We did not think of writing a book. My older son, Pat, had written a book because he worked in the Obama administration. Before I was elected to anything, I had no connection. He wrote a book, and his agent came to him a couple years later and said, well, Pat, do you have another book in you? And he said, no, but my brother and my mom might have a story to tell. So can you imagine? I'm running for Congress. It's summer of 2018, and the agent comes to visit with us and said, I think there's a book in your story. Would you like to write it? while I'm running for Congress.
Wow.
So we did. But I said, I can do it because I have to write only half. So we made an outline. Harry went his way. I went mine because we didn't want to taint our memories with the other person's memory. And then we had them dovetailed together, originally by my older son and then by the professional editors.
Wow.
It was tough.
What was the response to the book?
Heartening. And I said, when we were asked to do it, I said to Harry, you willing to do this? You willing to put this in print? And he said, yeah, if I can give...
Recovering out loud.
Yes. He said, if I can give one person hope, it's worth it.
Absolutely.
And that's what the response was.
Absolutely.
He gave us hope.
As a member of Congress, what were the reactions from your fellow Congresspeople?
That was what was so remarkable. I handed out a couple dozen of them to some of my friends.
Yeah.
And literally, within a week or two, several of them came up to me and said what you know. They said, I can't believe your book. Thank you for telling your story. Thank you for being so vulnerable and warts and all. Let me tell you about my sister. Let me tell you about my son.
Absolutely.
Let me tell you about my uncle that I lost. So many people see themselves in this crisis. And the reason we wanted to do it was to give hope, but also to shed the stigma, shed this shame.
Yes.
It happened under my roof. It can happen under yours.
Absolutely. I remember when I worked with Marty Mann way back in the 70s, and she was the founder of the National Council on Alcoholism and the first woman to stay sober in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I said, Marty, what are the three biggest challenges facing the field? And the answer she gave me is the same today as it was then. She said, fighting stigma, and fighting stigma.
See that?
I mean,
we have to keep doing it. You're doing your part.
We've made progress, but we have so far to go.
I know.
And it has to be out in the open. We have to be able to be open and honest about it and have conversations. Now, you mentioned this morning you had a conversation with President Biden, one-on-one, about alcoholism, addiction, and recovery.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes. We swapped books. I gave him our book, and he mailed me Hunter's book, which I read, of course.
Yes.
And then when I saw him next, I talked to him about it. I said, thank you so much for sharing Hunter's book. I could identify with so much of the pain and the joy of recovery. And he thanked me for my book, and he said, I promise to work with you. I said, Mr. President, if you and I can work on one thing together, it's going to be about this issue. And he said, I promise to work with you. It means so much to my family. So it was parent to parent. It felt so right.
Oh, my goodness. And let's keep our fingers crossed for the future.
Yes, we will do that.
Yes, indeed. What are the challenges facing Congress in terms of the drug crisis?
I think the bit of chaos and politics that's going on at the end of this Congress as we run toward an election, not to be political, but we're in an election cycle. But I tried to convey in here some hope, because this is a bipartisan set of bills that we are trying to pass. It has touched every family or your friend or your neighbor. So I'm hopeful, and that's my strategy, is to try to work with bipartisan members to move the most likely bills that will do the most good in the end of this 118th Congress, as we try to temper what's going on politically. I'm hoping we can do that.
Who are some of the other champions in Congress for our cause?
Well, we do have a bipartisan set of caucuses. Brian Fitzpatrick, who's a Republican in the district ahead of me. I was going to say Senator Casey, but he's a Democrat. But we have senators and members of Congress, Republican and Democrats, who are willing to be champions, meeting at these caucuses, learning more about it, just as we're learning more in here. So we have friends on both sides of the aisle.
What can individuals who are in long-term recovery do advocacy-wise in terms of their elected officials?
Reach out to them and say you must equitably force insurance companies to equitably treat people in recovery, must force Medicare to include recovery in the health services that are due us, all of us. Your voice matters. And it is important. Sure, it's important to encourage somebody like me, but go to people who maybe aren't paying attention, members who aren't paying attention to this yet, and say, join them. While the politics and the fighting could go on around you, if you can lift one person, one family into more meaningful care, long-term treatment, save a life, reach out to your Congress members. They listen.
I thank you so much, not only for being here and for spending a little bit of time with us, but for all that you do in Congress, and even more, all you have done with your family, and in terms of the blessings that you have encountered as a result of recovery.
Good use of language. A lot of blessings in our lives. Thank
Indeed.
you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed my conversation with Congresswoman Dean. We're going to hear from her son, Harry, and his story in just 30 seconds.
She has always been your baby. But when your daughter got into drugs and alcohol, she turned into a stranger. What do you do? Where do you turn? Contact Sundown M Ranch. Sundown's nationally recognized youth treatment program guides young people back to a life free of drugs and alcohol. All treatment is gender-specific and directed by caring certified professionals in a safe environment. You can get your daughter back and get to know her again. Go to www.sundown.org to learn more.
We continue Recovery Coast to Coast with Congresswoman Dean's son. We are back on Recovery Coast to Coast, taking the show on the road. We are in Denver, Colorado. Beautiful city and a beautiful organization, NAATP. NAATP. It stands for the National Association of Addiction Treatment Providers. I've been around NAATP since its very beginnings back in the late 70s when Michael Q. Ford was the guy who founded the organization. And I love coming to these conferences because I get to meet new people that I've not met before, learn about them, as well as catch up with old friends as well. And Harry is joining us, and he is an interesting guy. He is the Vice President of Business Development for one of the most outstanding treatment programs in the country, which I remember it as Chit Chat. Now it's the Karen organization. And Harry, you also are the son of Congresswoman Madeleine Dean.
Yes.
The backstory on that is absolutely incredible because you were a raging alcoholic addict while your mom was running for Congress and in a terribly dysfunctional situation. And you not only lived through it, thrived through it, found treatment, found recovery, and now you're helping others. You're working for the treatment program that you went through. It's a miracle.
It is a miracle. It's been an incredible journey.
Take us back to the dysfunctional days and before you went to Karen. And what your mom told me was it was just time. You were just sick and tired. Tell me about that.
By the time I got to Karen, I was 22 years old. Backtrack a little bit. For me, what started out seeming really, really normal in high school with a little bit of drinking on the weekends and smoking marijuana pretty quickly progressed to different substances, and my downfall came pretty fast. But I'll fast forward, and what I want to talk about is kind of my last year. The last year before I was willing to get help and to go to treatment.
And a lot of people try to get you help.
A lot of people. My mom tried over and over and over. She knew something was going on. In high school, I sort of started. I gave up on sports. I gave up on all the extracurricular activities. I had actually gotten accepted into 13 plus colleges and scholarships. And as soon as that happened, I was already pretty deep in my addiction, my active use. And as soon as that happened, I gave up and said, I'm going to coast. I've made it. And for me, that was actually a pretty dangerous thing to see, that in spite of using cocaine every day in school, the external validation of, hey, you're getting accepted, you're getting scholarships, it almost fueled this desire to keep going. And what ended up happening was I went off to college and I knew something was wrong. I knew that I had a problem. I didn't know what it was. I didn't want to call it what it was. But I made a decision and in high school that I was going to go to a college where I knew nobody, where none of my friends were going. I was going to go down to South Carolina. And I thought I would have a fresh start. And
you're going to work Harry's program.
I was going to work Harry's program. I later learned in the program, apparently wherever you go, you bring yourself with you. So I got to South Carolina thinking I'm going to go back to just some casual drinking and this is going to be manageable. And it wasn't. So I quickly transferred out of South Carolina, came back home.
That was obviously a geographic that did not work.
The geographic did not work, so I tried another geographic. I moved back to Philly, where I had all of my connections and all my old dealers and friends.
Oh boy.
And tried college up there, and that's where I was really introduced to opioids. Things really started to go downhill pretty quickly for me. I had been somebody who used drugs every day, but once opioids came into the picture, it just completely consumed everything about what I wanted to do. So I quickly found myself failing out of school, made a decision to drop out because at the time I thought going to work in a warehouse was the best opportunity for me. So I gave up on my college education, and what ended up happening was at 20 years old, I dropped out of school in the wake of this pretty horrific home invasion, where I had gotten robbed at gunpoint and, related to the lifestyle that I was living.
Whoa.
And, so I used that as an excuse. It wasn't my grades. I said, hey, it's not safe here. I'm going to drop out of school. So I'm 20, I go to work in this warehouse. I'm completely just lost in my addiction, and I find out that I'm going to become a father. A girl that I was seeing was pregnant, and as naive and, unprepared as I was, there was a moment there when I found out that I was really hopeful, because my life at that point was pretty desperate and sad, and there was not a lot going for me. But in that moment when I found out that I was going to become a father at 20, I had hope because I believed, and this is another one that didn't pan out, but I believed that having a daughter was going to save me. It was going to pull me out. I was going to be the dad that I knew I should be, wanted to be, could be. What ended up happening was right before my daughter was born, I was able to wean off of the opioids, and I had a couple of days on my own, self-will, white knuckle, and as soon as my daughter was born, I had done no other work in recovery. I had no network in recovery. I didn't know anything really about recovery, so I did what seemed right in the moment. I texted my best friend, who was also my drug dealer, and I said, hey man, here's a picture of my baby. You got to see her. Come to the hospital. Let's celebrate. And what celebrate meant was we were going to go right back to opioids. And before I left the hospital to take our daughter home, I was already back. I was back in my active use. I was sneaking out of the hospital to use one more. And for the next year of my daughter's life, it continued like that every day, where I just got to a point where I believed that, she'd be better off without me, because I didn't know recovery was possible. I didn't know there was an alternative. And I just felt like if I couldn't stop for her, then I was never going to stop.
Take me to October 30th.
So
2012.
October 30th, 2012, it is, set the scene. It's the weekend of Superstorm Sandy. We live in the Philadelphia area, so we got hit pretty well. And, so in that weekend, as somebody who's actively using drugs, I was, I needed to prepare, because I knew that, the mayor was shutting down the roads. I wasn't going to be able to get to my dealers. So I sort of stocked up for the weekend. And it also happened to be the weekend of my daughter's first birthday. So she turned 1 on October 26th. We had a party that weekend. Superstorm Sandy's coming. It's sort of chaos. And what happened was October 30th was a Tuesday. On Friday night, I asked my mom for money. I said, hey, Mom, which I did all the time. And I was, stealing from them, but I was asking for money too. I said, hey, Mom, I need a little bit of money to float me through the weekend till my next payday. And she said to me, there's something wrong with the bank account, so we can't. And in that moment, I went back. I remember going back to my bedroom that night. And by this point, my daughter's mother and I had moved back in with my parents, and we're trying to raise this baby and, cohabitate with, as new parents with my parents. But I went back to my room that night and I thought about it, and I knew what I had been doing, and I had been stealing from their ATM card night after night for a couple of months. It's a week out from her first election to a state representative, so there's a lot happening. And from Friday night until Tuesday, I was in my head trying to spin an excuse of where's this money gone, because I know once, she knows there's a problem with the bank account, she's going to see what's happening, and I need a story. So October 30th comes, and I walk downstairs, and across our dining room table is just a litany of bank statements. And on these bank statements, there's a bunch of highlighted transactions. And And before anybody said anything, I knew what it was, and I knew I was caught. The tears came, and I had nothing. And, when my mom tells this story, she says, she asked if I wanted help, and I said yes. And it was really because I had spent the last couple days, I had nothing. I had no story. I had no fight left in me. I didn't think that it would work, but I've heard kind of your best thinking, when I got to treatment, people said your best thinking got you here. It's like my best thinking did not get me into treatment. It kept me out of it.
Yeah.
It was really not until I felt like I had no other choice. And that was the only option I had left on the table.
Your mom,
yes.
who I spoke with earlier, told me that she was expecting this confrontation. And she even had a treatment center lined up for you so that when you said, okay, I'm done, she said, here's where you're going.
Yep.
Talk about that experience and going to Karen for the first time.
So it was that day. As soon as we left that dining room table, it felt like everything kind of kicked off into a whirlwind. And before I knew it, I was upstairs in my mom's bedroom, and I'm on the phone with an intake specialist at Karen going over a packing list and, what do we need? And I'm trying to say my goodbyes to my daughter's mother, who was blindsided by the whole thing. She had no idea that I was using and what was going on. So she was completely blindsided.
You were quite the hider then.
I was quite the hider.
She had no idea.
She had no idea.
Harry.
So I'm trying to navigate that with her and make arrangements for, she was in nursing school. We're young. She's still in college. We've got a baby at home. And so we're trying to make arrangements on how's she going to navigate that. And I've got to go to CVS and, get Nicorette lozenges for my my time away.
And Hurricane Sandy's coming.
Hurricane Sandy had just blown through. And what's interesting is I had this moment of clarity when, I was asked if I wanted help, and I said yes, and I fully wanted help. But what I did after that was I went out to the garage right away, because that's where I had my stash, and I used the rest of it. And I remember vividly, I was standing in the garage looking outside, and there's trees down, and kind of the neighborhood's a mess, and I had this kind of peace about it, where normally if I was using the last of my supply, I would be in high anxiety mode. I got to get more, and I didn't have that. Right, I had this little sense of peace of it's going to be what it is, and my parents and I drove up to Wernersville, Pennsylvania. It was about an hour and a half drive, and we didn't say much. At one point, I think my dad turned around and said, did you ever think about asking for help? And I just said I didn't feel like it was ever the right time. But that might have been the only question we asked, and I got there having no idea what to expect. It was pretty late in the evening by the time I got there and got searched and made my way through the intake process. I was pretty banged up when I got there, so I quickly kind of passed out. And what I remember most is waking up about 5 a.m, a nurse comes in. It's Halloween. She comes in to take my vitals. I wake up first day in rehab, and she has these, cat headband on with whiskers painted on her face, and I'm like, what did I get myself into?
Oh my gosh. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween. I'll never forget it.
What were the first couple of weeks like in treatment?
Brutal. Brutal. I really struggled with the withdrawal process,
Yeah,
and even
I bet.
with, some medication management, coming off of it, not being able to sleep, the restless legs. And, the hardest part for me was I went in there with the idea that I just need to stop using opioids. Everything else is kind of fine. Alcohol wasn't my problem.
Yeah.
Smoking wasn't my problem. It's just these opioids that are, ruining my life.
Reality check.
I started to learn otherwise that, really any mind or mood altering substance, I had no control over. The other thing that was hard was, being told about this continuum of care, because I thought I had just kind of signed up for 28 days and I was going to go there, I was going to go back, I was going to save my relationship, get back to my job, and, my life would be fine. I just was going to get my life back. I had to grapple with the fact that I didn't know if I wanted that life back, or what life I wanted, or what it was going to look like.
A real crossroads.
It was a real crossroads. I definitely tried to lean on the fact I was 22 by the time I got there, and I was with a group of young men. It was the Young Men's Program. And I tried to lean on, I've got this career. I was working in a call center making nothing. And I was like, I'm a father. It's like I was living in my parents' house with a baby. But I tried to really lean on, I've got all these responsibilities. I need to get home. I'm different. I just need to get back to my life. My counselors saw right through that. And we battled, and I battled with my parents while I was there. I just wanted to come home, and I fought it really, really hard. But there was, a moment at the end where they made a recommendation, said, hey, you need to go for at least another 90 days, to this other sober living house.
Yeah.
That was one of the hardest decisions, because I kind of knew in that moment, and it turned out to be true, that making that decision to stay in treatment was the best thing for me, but I also knew that it would absolutely destroy the relationship that I had with my daughter's mother. But they kept saying whatever you put in front of your recovery is going to be the first thing you lose. And so I stuck with it, and I went on to another program for another 90 days. That was probably the hardest and also likely the most important decision I've made in my life to this point, was to stick with it.
Wow.
Because after that, the decision to stay got easier and easier. That was the one that was so incredibly hard, where it was a true crossroads of I could go home, and I don't think you and I would be having this conversation had I gone home.
What happened to the relationship?
My daughter's mother and I, while I was in that next program, had conversations and decided to separate. We have today, almost 12 years later, an incredible relationship as co-parents. We talk about every day, and share custody of our daughter Aubrey, and really have an incredible dynamic, something that I could not have envisioned. But I had this identity sort of crisis in that time of my parents are together still. When I had a daughter, I just wanted, I wanted that for her. And I didn't know what it was like to not give her that, and I was so afraid. But I knew, and my daughter's mother knew, that for the best for both of us was for us to go our own way to heal, so that we could be the best possible parents for our daughter.
Yeah. Fast forward to your working where you went through treatment.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
It's been surreal. So about 5 years ago, I was about 6 years into recovery. I reached out to Karen. I had been working in the bicycle industry and, doing sales, and something that was, I loved, but I wasn't as passionate about, right? So about 5 years in, I reached out to Karen and said, hey, here's my resume. I don't know what I can do for you. I don't know what jobs exist in this field, but I would love to be a part of this organization. I'd love to give back, and I'd love to do something that, feels really, really meaningful. So I was able to find a position in business development, was successful there, and I've had multiple opportunities to grow. And what I can say is really, it's definitely work. It's hard work, what we do in this field, but every day that I do it, it feels different from how it used to feel when I got up and went to a job in the bicycle industry. This feels meaningful, and I know that what I'm doing really has an impact.
So rewarding.
So rewarding.
Harry, what does recovery mean to you today?
So my answer to that is very different from what it meant in the very beginning. I think, when I first got into recovery, it was just not use. I just need to not use today. And while that for me is still a really important part of it, recovery for me really means to be able to continue to grow, to evolve and to change, and to continuously just try to be a better person. My recovery over the years, I've been in recovery consistently since October 30th, 2012, when I showed up at Karen. That was my first and only time in treatment. And, when I think about recovery today, I think about really the opportunity to heal. And that's an ever-moving target for me. It continues to, there's layers and layers of this recovery onion that I continue to peel back.
Tell me about the book. You wrote a book with your mom.
We wrote a book, not something I ever thought I would do, especially when I was, failing out of English 101 in college. But we were approached with the opportunity to write a book, and both of us kind of, at first we balked at it a little bit of, that's not us. And when we thought about it, it really came down to, if we can help one person, it's worth it. And I'll tell you why, for me, it was so important. because for me at 22, when I was walking into treatment, I couldn't identify a single person in recovery. I didn't know anyone. I didn't know that this way of life was possible. I didn't know that treatment worked. I didn't know that there was another way out. And I had believed that my daughter would be better off without me. And I didn't know that I could be a father in recovery. And I didn't know that I could have the life that I have today. So I always say, our book, it's a memoir. It's not a how-to. There's a lot of moms that call me and it's like, well, I just want my son to do what you did. That's not what it's about. It's one story of recovery. There's, more than 23 million Americans in recovery. And I think if we can share our stories collectively, there's so much hope in that, to talk about the different pathways of how we got here, to make it feel attainable for others. Because for me, for a long time, this did not feel attainable.
Yeah. You spoke this morning and you mentioned something that I'd not heard before, the expression unfairly fair.
So we talk about in the book that I was, I use the expression I was treated unfairly fair. And this, for me, it's discrimination. It is. It really is. I mean, when I look back at my experience, I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I used drugs primarily in North Philly and in Kensington and, these different parts of the city. And when I would go there, I was this young white kid, and I had was driving my parents' car, which was nice, and I had an address on my ID that said I was from the, Montgomery County. And
person of privilege.
Absolutely a person of privilege. And I say that because when I would, have a run-in with the cops, they would look at my ID, they would look at me, and they would just say, hey, just go home. They would pull drugs out of my pocket and give it back and say, just go home. And I think about the impact that this disease has on people, right? And the fact that I lived the way that I did, and I did the things that I did. I stole, I did a lot of things that, if I got what I deserved, I would not be where I'm at. But the fact that I was, entering early recovery and I had no criminal record is unbelievable.
Wow.
And I'll tell a quick story, but I had two best friends in high school. For me, this has been really just impactful thing about, you called it a blessing, right? And, I think about it as, unfairly fair. Luke and Matt were my two best friends, and the three of us did everything together. We started drinking together, we started smoking together, we started doing coke together, and we started doing opioids together. And if you fast forward now 12 years, from when all of that was happening, all of us struggle with this disease. We all had a substance use disorder. We're talking today about my outcome. But when I think about Luke's outcome was he wound up in prison for a long time as a direct result of his involvement with drugs. And Matt ended up passing away from a fentanyl overdose. And I think about unfairly fair, and I think about all of the people, right, where we're in this, and I've got no reason, the police stuff, that's privilege, the, school stuff, that's privilege, but I think about the overall outcomes and the friends that I've lost in this, and the fact that this life is accessible or should be accessible, and yet it's 2024 and we're losing over 110,000 people a year to substance use disorder, poisoning, overdose. That doesn't even count alcohol.
Yeah.
And I just think, going back to the work that I get to do today, the purpose that I have, working for care and treatment centers, trying to help others access care for a disease that can be so ruthless, is really become my mission in life, is to try to allow more people to see the hope that is possible in this, but even more importantly, to try to be able to access and attain it.
The book, by the way, is called Under Our Roof, A Son's Battle for Recovery and a Mother's Battle for Her Son. It's a great book, and it's a great story to tell. And after listening to you speak today and knowing about your lineage and knowing about what your mom has done and her contributions to our country, a question that has been bothering me all day, I said, I got to ask him, are you interested in running for public office?
I would say potentially where I'm at in my life. So I talked a
I'm
little
not asking you to throw your hat in the ring for anything, but
I'm not putting my hat in the ring just yet. I feel like I've got a lot to learn. Most importantly, I talked a little bit about my oldest. My oldest daughter, Aubrey, is 12, but I have 2 other young ones. I've got a 4-year-old Sawyer, a 2-year-old Scotty, and I've got a 4th on the way. So I have seen my mom's schedule and the way that she runs around, and I can just tell you that my wife is not on board with me running for office anytime soon.
It's not exactly a denial, but we'll go ahead and take it as one day at a time.
One day at a time.
One day
Not
at a
today.
time. Not today.
I'm not running today.
Do you know Tom Coderre?
Yes, I know Tom well.
You remind me of Tom Coderre.
He's a great guy.
You remind me of Tom.
Great guy.
Tom and I grew up in the same town, and his background and his story and your background and your story, I mean, they dovetail.
Yeah.
And that's why I had to ask you.
Yeah, he's a great advocate.
He is.
Really
he is.
good guy.
As are you, Harry.
Thank you.
Thank you so
And
much.
you.
And I appreciate your time, and invite people to buy the book, Under Our Roof, A Son's Battle for Recovery, A Mother's Battle for Her Son. I wish you continued success one day at a time.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks, Harry. Pretty amazing story of recovery from Harry Canaan, preceded by his mom's side of the story. Recovery is as recovery does. I want to remind listeners of this podcast, if you would like to tell your story of recovery, regardless of the path that you've chosen, and as long as you have been in continuous recovery for at least a year or more, please drop us a note, recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. And now, as promised, some inspirational thoughts from a guy in long-term recovery, really long-term, like over 50 years, actor Dick Van Dyke.
Men who try to do something and fail are infinitely better off than those who try to do nothing and succeed. Lloyd James. We all know that risk-taking is necessary to progress. It's hard to disagree with the idea, nothing ventured, nothing gained. However, it's a lot easier to accept an idea philosophically than to overcome the obstacles that prevent us from trying to do what we want to do. For a great many people, the most formidable of these obstacles is fear, which in these matters takes various forms. There is ego-generated fear, which tells us that we'd better not take the risk because we might fail, and then we'd look bad. There's the fear of change and disruption in our lives, which tells us we'll be better off if we don't rock the boat. And there is self-centered fear, which causes us to worry that we'll lose what we already have, even if we don't particularly want it. For some, just being able to acknowledge their fear can propel them into action. But many of us have learned that we can approach our new ventures with considerably more self-assurance and strength when we take the further step of relying on God. In these matters, as well as all others, we are at our best and able to succeed most fully when we seek His infinite wisdom and power. Thought for the day: when we don't try something for fear of looking bad, we already look bad to ourselves.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. If you've enjoyed our podcast, please share it with others via social media or simply by telling someone about it. Tell one friend. We'd appreciate it. You can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. And again, if you'd like to get in touch with us, we'd love to hear from you. Our email address is recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. And please hit the subscribe or follow button. It's free, and you'll be notified the next time we publish a podcast. Remember, if you know someone who is experiencing problems with alcohol or any other drug, here is a 24-hour national helpline that offers free information and confidential treatment referrals. And Spanish-speaking individuals are available as well. The number is 1-800-622-HELP. And we encourage you to check out findsupport.gov. This is a website designed for individuals, families, and friends. It has information on how to pay for treatment, including low-cost and free treatment options. You'll find healthcare support as well, how to help someone else or find help for yourself. It's all in one place in findsupport.gov. And join us next time for America's Voice for Recovery, Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. And another shout out to our sponsoring organization, Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins. I'm Neil Scott, reminding you to stay healthy live in gratitude, and be kind to others. Remember, the bright side of addiction is recovery. Pass it on.